The wind had teeth that morning. It came down from the Bear Paw foothills, hard and bitter, dragging dust across the road outside Willow Bend Crossing and pushing it into Alma Heavy Willow's eyes until they watered. She crouched beside a thorn bush with one hand wrapped around a branch and the other digging carefully through dry leaves for chokecherries the birds had missed. Her fingers were scratched, her knees ached, hunger sat inside her like a stone that had learned her name. She found 3 berries shriveled and black, each one more pit than flesh. Alma put them in her mouth anyway. They tasted of frost dust and old bitterness. She chewed slowly, not because they helped much, but because a person could not fall apart while chewing. Her mother used to say hunger listened for weakness. Alma would not give it the satisfaction. Behind her a horse stopped. Leather creaked. A bit rang softly. The rider did not speak at first, and that silence was worse than a question. Alma could feel him looking at her at the width of her back beneath the faded brown shawl, at the heavy shape of her body bent near the ditch, at the patched skirt pulled tight across her hips, at the boots whose soles had worn so thin that every stone in the road had become personal. Then the man said, "Can you cook?" Alma did not turn. The wind tugged loose strands from her braid and pushed them across her cheek. She found one more dried berry beneath a thorn and pinched it free. "Depends," she said. "On what? On what you mean by cooking." The horse shifted. The man waited. Alma swallowed the bitter fruit, wiped her purple-stained fingers on her skirt, and stood. She did not stand quickly. A body that had walked 16 miles on nothing but creek water and chokecherries did not owe speed to any man. When she turned, she lifted her chin before she met his eyes. The rider was lean and weather-cut, with a dark hat pulled low and a coat that had seen work but not poverty. His horse was better fed than she was. He had the look of a man who owned fence lines, debts, and decisions. "I mean, feeding men," he said. "Ranch hands. 14 by week's end, maybe more." Alma studied him the way he studied her. "If you mean burning meat black and boiling coffee until it could take paint off a door, plenty can cook. If you mean working dough when the flour's damp, keeping a stove from choking stretching beans, when the road closes, saving scraps before fools call them waste, and feeding men when weather wants them dead, then yes." Her voice stayed even. "I can cook." Something moved in his face, not quite surprise, not quite respect. "What's your name?" "Alma Heavy Willow." Silas Crow. Cold Crow Creek Ranch. She had heard of the place. 18 miles north and west under the broken prairie before the Bear Paws lifted dark against the sky. Cattle country, wind country, country where winter did not knock before entering. Silas's eyes dropped to the canvas bag hanging from her shoulder. It held all she owned now, her mother's recipe papers, a dented tin spoon, a washed thin towel, a strip of muslin, and a small leather ledger. Everything else had gone after Nita Heavy Willow was buried. The cook stove, the milk cows, the little homestead with its low roof and warm kitchen smell. Sold, signed away, counted by other men's numbers until nothing was left but Alma and the road. Silas did not ask about any of it. He only looked toward the trail. "I need a cook." Alma pressed one hand against her empty stomach so lightly it might have been only to smooth her skirt. "Then point the way." He shifted in the saddle. "Climb up. I'll walk." "No." His eyebrows lifted. "My feet still belong to me," she said. "I'll use them while they do." For a long moment the only sound was wind over dry grass. Then Silas swung down from the horse and took the reins. They walked. The ranch appeared first as a dark line against the pale land. Then shape gathered around it, a main house set square to the wind, a bunkhouse leaning slightly with age, corrals silvered with frost. Haystacks tied low, a smokehouse hunched near the yard, and beyond it all, Cold Crow Creek running thin beneath a skin of ice. From the road, the place looked sturdy. Alma knew better than to trust a thing from the road. The yard smelled of cattle, wood smoke, old manure, and coming snow. A blue heeler mix lifted her head from beside the porch and watched Alma with sharp brown eyes. Somewhere near the barn, a boy ducked out of sight. Men glanced from fencework and doorways, their looks brief and cutting. Alma knew those looks. She had carried them most of her life. Fat girl, kitchen girl, slow girl, soft girl. They saw her body before they saw her hands. They saw her hunger and thought it was weakness. They saw the canvas bag and thought it held nothing important. Silas opened the kitchen door. Smoke met them like a warning. It hung beneath the rafters in a gray, bitter layer. The stove wore soot around the firebox. Ash had built too high under the grate. A flour sack leaned against an outside wall, its bottom corners hardened by damp. Salt pork hung where warmth collected instead of where air moved. A barrel of potatoes breathed out that sweet-sour smell of rot beginning its quiet work. Beans sat on the floor. The coffee pot was blackened inside, deep enough to ruin water before it boiled. Silas stood beside her. "Well?" Alma set her canvas bag on the table. She did not sigh. She did not complain. She only looked. The room was not dirty in the ordinary sense. It had been swept. The pans were stacked. The knives were on their pegs. But care was not the same as understanding. This kitchen had been surviving on habit, and habit had begun to rot. A laugh came from the doorway. An old man with a gray beard and thick wrists leaned against the frame, arms crossed. His name, Silas said, was Tobias Flint. His eyes moved over Alma from head to boot and stopped where cruel men's eyes always stopped, on the size of her. "Well," Tobias said, "I hope she cooks better than she walks. Men don't need a fat girl studying corners. They need meat and coffee." A few men outside chuckled. Alma reached into her bag and pulled out the strip of muslin. Tobias frowned. "What's that supposed to be, a question?" Alma said. She turned to Silas. "I'll need 2 buckets rags. Lye soap, a scraper dry split wood, and water that isn't half mud." Tobias barked another laugh. "She hasn't cooked a bean and already wants supplies." Alma walked to the stove and crouched. Her knees complained, but she ignored them. She opened the firebox, cleared the ash down to a thin breathing bed, then held the muslin near the opening. The cloth trembled, fluttered weakly, then hung still. She watched it a moment longer. "The fire isn't the trouble," she said. "The smoke doesn't know where to go." Tobias snorted. "Smoke goes up. Even children know that, not when men choke its road and blame the stove." The room fell quiet enough for the stove to tick. Silas looked at Tobias, then at the ash bucket. Get her what she asked for. By noon, Alma had scraped soot-cleared ash, shifted the wood, opened the damper, and set beans to soaking. She moved with care rather than speed, one task tied cleanly to the next. A young girl with dark eyes and a red wool shawl came in carrying dried chokecherries wrapped in cloth. She introduced herself as Tala Redwater and said little else. But when Alma asked for clean jars, Tala found them. When Alma moved the salt pork, Tala nodded as if she had seen such work before. Near the back door, a narrow-shouldered stable boy lingered with a feed pail in hand. Alma noticed him looking at the smoke. "What's your name?" "Caleb Softhorse. You watch the animals." He nodded. "Then you watch more than most." His eyes widened as though nobody had ever told him that watching counted. The first biscuits failed. Their tops browned too fast while the middle stayed wet and heavy. Tobias made sure everyone saw. He broke one open and laughed as steam rose from the doughy center. "There she is," he called, "Queen of the cook stove." Alma took the biscuit from him before he could throw it. She split it cleanly, studied the crumb, then opened her ledger and wrote with a stub of pencil. Fire too hot at mouth, dead heat at rear, ash bed uneven. Tobias stared. "You writing its obituary?" Alma looked up at him. "A hungry body still knows how to count what the proud have wasted." Nobody laughed then. She thinned the ash again, shifted the pan, fed the fire smaller pieces, and tried once more. By evening, the kitchen smelled of bean broth, salt pork, skillet bread, and coffee that had been saved from bitterness. The men came in expecting little. They left their bowls empty. Silas took one biscuit and ate it without speaking. Then he reached for another. Alma saw it. She gave no smile. Pride was a thing best kept banked like coals. After supper, while the men pushed back from the table, she sorted leftovers into 3 buckets. Bones for broth, bread ends for mash, and true waste. An old cowhand with a weathered face and a long braid streaked gray watched from the shadows. Silas called him Amos Two Moons. Amos looked at the buckets, then at Alma's ledger lying open beneath the lamp. "That girl ain't just feeding supper," he said quietly. "She's measuring winter." Outside, frost silvered the pump handle. The wind shifted northeast and pressed smoke low across the roof. Alma stood alone after the dishes were done, pencil in hand, counting flour beans, salt pork, coffee, mouths cattle scraps, and days. The ranch slept around her. The cold did not. Before dawn, while the ranch still lay under a thin blue darkness, Alma Heavy Willow was already awake. The kitchen had cooled in the night, but it no longer smelled dead. The old smoke had thinned. The stove sat quiet ash banked low, its iron belly waiting. Alma stood beside it with her shawl wrapped around her shoulders and her ledger open on the table. Outside, the wind scraped along the walls as if testing every crack. She wrote by the last weak glow of the lamp. Flour 38 pounds, beans 2 sacks, salt pork 71 pounds less first cutting, coffee low, potatoes some soft, onions 3 good 4 doubtful, men 11, present 14 expected, heifers 9 weak, weather northeast. She stopped there, pencil resting between her fingers. Northeast wind meant something in that country. It came low off the broken prairie and drove cold into places that had looked safe the day before. Her mother had taught her that weather did not begin in the sky. It began in little warnings. A dog uneasy by the stove horses turning their tails to the wind, smoke flattening birds flying lower than they should. Alma closed the ledger and tied her apron. The pantry was first. She carried the flour sacks away from the outside wall one by one. Her back ached before the second was moved, but pain was not an argument. Pain was only information. She rested when she needed to, then bent again, her broad hands gripping burlap, her boots planted steady on the plank floor. Tala Redwater appeared in the doorway with a bundle under her arm. She did not announce herself. She simply stood there watching Alma drag a sack of beans onto 2 scraps of cottonwood. "You'll hurt yourself," Tala said. "Not as bad as damp flour will hurt 15 hungry people." Tala looked at the wall where the sack had been. A dark stain showed along the boards near the floor. "My grandmother raised food off the ground," she said, "even dried berries. Then your grandmother understood more than most ranchmen." That almost made Tala smile. Together they shifted what could be shifted. Flour and cornmeal went to the driest shelf. Beans were lifted onto scrapboards. Potatoes were carried from the wet corner of the root cellar and spread where cool air could move around them. Onions were separated good from soft dry skins from damp ones. Salt pork was moved away from stale warmth and hung where the air passed steady but not hard. Tobias Flint came in scratching his beard and stopped short when he saw the pantry disturbed. "What in thunder are you doing now, keeping food from dying before men eat it?" He stared at the barrels, the sacks, the jars, the boards under everything. "Those potatoes have sat in that corner 10 years. Alma reached into the nearest barrel and pulled out one soft potato. Its skin sagged under her thumb. When she squeezed gently, a sour wetness seeped through and darkened her fingers. She held it up. It only takes one spoiled thing to teach the rest how to die. Tobias opened his mouth, but no words came fast enough. He looked at the potato, then at the others. Alma dropped the bad one into a bucket. "That goes to the pig pit, not the stew." By sunup, the kitchen was alive with quieter work. Tala washed jars in hot water. Alma set bones from the night before into a kettle with onion skins and a strip of salt pork. The broth would not be rich, but it would be honest. She skimmed it as it warmed, saving every spoonful of fat in a cup. Near the back door, Caleb's soft horse lingered in his coat, a feed bucket hanging from one hand. The boy was thin as a fence slat with dark hair that fell into his eyes and a habit of standing where others forgot him. Alma saw him watching the window. "What are the horses doing?" she asked. He blinked, surprised she had spoken to him. Standing back end to the northeast, all of them most. The old bay started first, others followed. Alma wiped her hand, opened the ledger, and wrote it down. Tobias snorted from the stove. "Now, horsetails are kitchen business. Everything that warns of weather is kitchen business," Alma said. Caleb stepped closer, emboldened by the answer. Crows flew low, too, toward the creek. Alma wrote that down as well. Silas Crow came in while she was still writing. His eyes moved over the raised sacks, the jars, the shifted barrels, then to the ledger. "I thought that book held recipes," he said. "It does." He looked at the columns. "Looks like numbers. Recipes are numbers when winter is coming." He said nothing, but he did not laugh. After breakfast, Alma went to the lower pen. Frost clung white to the rails, and the ground was hard beneath her boots. 9 young heifers stood near the far side, heads low, coats dull. They were not starving, but they were not ready. Their hips showed. Their ribs moved too clearly when they breathed. Silas leaned on the fence beside her. "May have to sell them," he said. "Hay's short. Credit office in Fort Benton wants money before spring. If snow comes early, those 9 will eat more than they return." Alma watched the smallest heifer nose through old hay, then turn away. "What do you throw out after meals?" Silas frowned. "What bread ends. Sour milk, bean water, bran, potato peelings that aren't rotten." He looked toward the kitchen. "Ask Tobias." "I did not ask who wastes it. I asked what there is." By noon, she had a bucket beside the stove. Bread ends, wheat bran sour milk, warm water, and a pinch of salt. She stirred until it made a pale mash, then carried it to the lower pen with Caleb following close behind. The first heifer sniffed and backed away. Another pushed its nose in, sneezed and turned. The smallest did not come at all. Tobias had followed them out. He laughed into the cold. Even cattle got sense enough not to eat from a fat girl's slop bucket. Alma stood still, watching the mash settle too thin in the trough. "You put too much water," Caleb said softly, then looked frightened as if he had insulted her. Alma nodded. "I did." She carried the bucket back. The next morning she used less water and more bran. The heifers sniffed longer. One took a mouthful, then another. The third morning all but the smallest ate. Alma waited by the rail hands tucked into her shawl breadth, showing white in the air. Caleb stood beside her. "I call that little red one Ember." "Little Ember," Alma said. "Then she had better learn to burn." As if hearing her, the weakest heifer stepped forward at last and lowered her head to the trough. No one cheered, but Reuben Pike, the lead hand, watched from the gate and gave one slow nod. The ranch changed by inches after that. Men began wiping their boots before stepping into the kitchen, not because Alma scolded them, because the room had begun to feel kept. Reuben moved 2 haystacks closer to the lower pen after Alma pointed out how deep drifts would block the wagon path. Silas repaired the loose root cellar latch without saying why. Tala hung dried choke cherries and herbs where the air moved clean. Caleb watched horses and cattle as if his looking had finally become a job worth doing. Even Tobias changed, though he fought it like a man fighting medicine. He still grumbled. He still muttered that men had survived winters before Alma Heavy Willow waddled into their kitchen. But every evening, a small stack of split kindling appeared beside the stove, each piece no thicker than a child's wrist. Alma noticed. She said nothing. One afternoon, a rider came in from the east with 2 men behind him and laughter already in his mouth. Luther Bell owned a spread beyond the creek bottoms where the land flattened and the wind ran unobstructed for miles. He was broad, red-faced, and pleased with himself in the way of men who had never yet been corrected by anything stronger than weather. He found Alma near the smokehouse, counting saved scraps and marking figures on a board. "What's this I hear?" Luther called. "Silas got himself a counting cook." Tobias smirked, though not as boldly as he might have a week earlier. Alma kept writing. Luther swung down from his horse. "Winter comes every year. Beef, firewood, and a good gun. That's all a ranch needs." Alma looked past him to the roofline. Smoke from the kitchen chimney did not rise clean. It slid sideways, pressed flat by the wind. "The storm does not care who owns the ranch," she said. "It only cares who prepared." Luther laughed loud enough for the yard to hear. "You hear that Silas better let the kitchen run the cattle." Silas did not answer. Old Amos Two Moons sat near the barn mending a rawhide tie. His eyes stayed on his work, but his voice carried. "A loud man hears himself. A winter-wise woman hears the wind." Luther's smile thinned. He mounted and rode off with his men still laughing, though not as freely. That evening, while Alma stirred broth, Silas entered with an envelope in his hand. He laid it on the table beside her ledger. The paper was clean and stiff, the seal broken. "Fort Benton Credit Office," he said. Alma looked at the letter, then through the window toward the lower pen. Little Ember stood at the trough, thin legs braced, eating warm mash with the others. How much, Alma asked. $525. The kettle gave a soft simmer. Outside, the northeast wind pressed against the house and made the lantern above the porch tremble. Silas folded the letter once. "Gideon Sutter is coming. He wants the heifers sold before the snow makes the choice for us." Alma wiped her hands and opened the ledger. For a long while she said nothing. She only began adding columns where the recipes ended and winter began. The letter from Fort Benton lay beside Alma's ledger all through breakfast, clean and stiff, as if it had never known smoke, grease, or weather. No one touched it. Men came in from the cold with their collars up and their hands red from morning work. They ate beans, skillet bread, and salt pork without their usual joking. Even Tobias Flint kept his complaints low, though he glanced at the letter more than once, as if paper itself could spoil a meal. Alma moved between stove and table, filling cups, setting down plates, watching without seeming to watch. Outside the window, the 9 heifers stood in the lower pen with frost on their backs. Little Ember, still narrow through the ribs, had pushed her nose into the warm mash before the others that morning. Caleb's soft horse had seen it and come running to tell her, his face bright in a way he tried to hide. Alma had written it down. Little Ember first to trough. No hesitation. Numbers mattered. But so did the order in which a hungry animal chose to live. Near noon the buggy came. It rolled into the yard on polished wheels too clean for the season, its black cover shining like a beetle shell beneath the pale sun. The horse pulling it was sleek, well-shod, and annoyed by the ruts. The man who stepped down wore a dark wool coat, leather gloves, and boots that had met mud only by accident. Gideon Sutter did not look toward the barn first. He looked at the house. Men like him always knew where tables were. Silas Crow met him at the porch. They spoke briefly, words carried away by the wind. Alma watched from the kitchen doorway as Gideon removed one glove finger by finger, taking his time with each motion. He had the manner of a man who believed delay belonged to him and urgency to poorer people. When he entered the dining room, he did not remove his coat. "Mr. Crow," he said, placing a leather case on the table, "I trust you have considered the matter with a clear head." Silas remained standing. "I've considered it." Gideon opened the case and withdrew several folded papers. They were smooth white and neatly marked. He spread them over the scarred table while the last dinner bowl still sat unwashed at one end. Alma's eyes followed the papers. Debt had a smell even when ink pretended otherwise. "The balance remains $525, Gideon said. "With winter feed uncertain and cattle prices weakening, the most sensible action is the sale of the 9 young heifers before snow closes the route." Tobias shifted near the stove. Reuben Pike stood by the far wall with his arms crossed. Old Amos Two Moon sat under the window mending a rawhide tie, though the strip had not moved in his hand since Gideon began speaking. Gideon tapped one paper. "The offer is fair for animals in their condition. Low, yes, but fair. Keeping them through winter risks hayfeed, labor, and debt for stock that may not stand until thaw." Silas looked through the window toward the lower pen. "They've been eating better. For now." Gideon smiled thinly. "A few warm buckets do not change arithmetic." Alma stood at the breadboard, flour to her wrists, dough beneath her palms. She pressed once folded, turned. The motion steadied her breathing. Gideon's gaze shifted toward her at last. It paused on her broad shoulders, her full arms, the white flour dusting the front of her dress, the heavy shape of her body behind the table. "The kitchen woman needn't trouble herself," he said lightly. "This is credit business." The dough made a soft sound under Alma's hands. No one spoke. A piece of flour fell from her wrist to the floor. It landed quietly, but the room was quiet enough to hear it. Alma wiped one hand on her apron, then the other. She walked to the side table and picked up her ledger. The little book looked almost foolish, beside Gideon's papers, worn leather-softened corners. Flour caught in the cracks of the cover. She laid it on the table. Gideon glanced at it. "Recipes some." He gave a small laugh. "I admire thrift, Miss Heavywillow," Alma said. "Miss Heavywillow? But ranch credit is not decided by biscuit instructions." Alma opened the ledger. The pages fell where her fingers knew them. Flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, then feed, mash, hay use, weather signs, cattle behavior, scraps saved, broth stores, days of possible isolation, projected spring value if the heifers lived to calf. Silas leaned closer. Gideon did not at first. Alma placed one flour-dusted finger beside a column. 3 weeks ago, the 9 heifers refused dry hay and left mash untouched. Now, all 9 eat twice daily. Feed waste has dropped because the mash is warm and portioned small, the weakest one. Little Ember came first to the trough this morning. Gideon looked amused. "You named the animal Caleb did, the stable boy." "The one who watches them." Gideon folded his hands. "Markets are not moved by stable boys." "No," Alma said, "but cattle are not markets until men sell them." That brought Gideon's eyes fully to her. She turned the page. If they are sold now, the debt shrinks. The breeding herd shrinks with it. If they stand through winter, their value in spring is not just beef. It is calves, contracts, and the start of a stronger herd. My figures are based on today's market. Alma rested her finger on the next line. Your figures count debt. Mine count what survives long enough to pay it. The room stilled so completely the stove seemed loud. Gideon's face didn't change much, but his eyes sharpened. He reached for the ledger, then stopped as if touching it would admit something. "Kitchen arithmetic." Old Amos spoke without lifting his head. "That is the only kind of counting winter respects." Tobias looked at the floor. Alma turned another page. 15 mouths can eat 11 days with no supply road if waste stays as low as this week. Longer if storm meals begin before fresh bread. The flour will keep if raised from damp. Beans will stretch with broth. Coffee can be boiled down and cut with water. Hay remains short, but warm mash will reduce loss in the weakest animals. Gideon's voice cooled. And when snow buries the road, when your warm buckets freeze, when those heifers drop in the pen. Then your sale paper will look wise, Alma said, but paper looking wise has never fed a cow. Reuben's mouth twitched, though he did not smile. Gideon turned to Silas. You are an excellent cattleman. Do not confuse care with business. Silas looked at the sale agreement. It lay ready penned beside it, as simple as surrender. Alma did not ask him to refuse. She had learned long ago that begging made truth look weaker. She closed her ledger halfway, but kept one hand on it. Through the window, Caleb stood at the lower fence. He had one arm resting on the rail and his eyes fixed on little Ember, as if willing her to keep eating. Tala Redwater came from the smokehouse carrying dried herbs in a cloth. She paused when she saw the dining room full of stillness. Silas followed Alma's gaze. Then he reached for the agreement. Tobias drew a slow breath. Silas picked up the paper, studied it once more, and pushed it back across the table. We keep them. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. They settled over the room with the final weight of a gate dropped into place. Gideon looked at the paper, then at Silas. If the snow closes your road and those heifers die, the credit office will not renegotiate because a cook kept a hopeful book. Silas said nothing. Alma opened the ledger again and made one small mark beside the heifer column. Gideon gathered his papers with careful hands. At the door he turned. Winter has a way of separating wisdom from stubbornness. Old Amos looked up then. It does. After Gideon left, the buggy wheels cracked over frozen ruts until the sound thinned into the wind. For a while no one moved. Then Tobias muttered, if those heifers die, folks will remember who talked sense out of this room. Alma lifted the dough from the breadboard and set it into a greased bowl. Folks remember dying cattle easier than hungry men. That is why we prepare for both, she began that afternoon. Hard biscuits, first baked dry enough to last. Tala crushed dried chokecherries and mixed them with tallow for small winter cakes. Caleb brought reports from the barn horses, restless crows, low little Ember eating. Reuben moved hay closer to the lower pen. Silas hauled boards for another pantry shelf. Old Amos repaired rawhide ties and checked fence knots. Tobias said nothing, but near dusk the kindling stack beside the stove grew taller, every piece split no thicker than a child's wrist. Alma hung a board near the pantry door and wrote with charcoal. No flour on damp floors. Warm the flue first. Feed small and often. Broth before dawn. No man goes out alone. No waste from this hour forward. Night came early, cold and hard. The ranch had just settled when Bluebell sprang up from beside the stove and barked toward the corrals. Once. Twice. Then again, sharper. Caleb was first to the door, but Alma caught his sleeve. Coat. He grabbed it. The wind struck them as soon as Reuben opened the door. Lantern light shook across the yard. From the lower pen came the faint, panicked scrape of hooves against wood. Little Ember was tangled near the fence, one hind leg caught in a slack rope frozen stiff at the post. She trembled so hard the rail knocked beneath her weight. Reuben cut the rope. Caleb held the lantern. Alma moved in close, speaking low, one hand on the heifer's neck, the other steady against her shoulder. The animal quivered under her palm, all bone and fear and stubborn warmth. Easy, Alma whispered. Easy now. You are not done. Together they guided little Ember behind the haystack where the wind could no longer strike her head on. The heifer stood there shaking, but standing. Alma kept her hand against the narrow neck until she felt the warmth answer. Alive is enough for tonight, she said. Above the Bear Paw foothills, the sky had gone the color of iron. The horses in the barn had turned their backs to the northeast again. When Alma returned to the kitchen, she opened her ledger with stiff fingers and wrote one final line beneath the day's figures. Storm close. No waste from this hour forward. The blizzard came before sunrise, not as falling snow, but as a white animal throwing itself against the walls. Alma Heavy Willow woke to the sound of the house groaning. For one breath she lay still on the narrow cot beside the pantry, listening. The wind did not whistle. It roared low and hard, filling the dark with a sound like river ice breaking. Somewhere outside, a loose shutter slapped once, twice, then tore free and vanished into the storm. Bluebell barked from the kitchen. Alma was on her feet before the second bark ended. Cold had already crept under the door and across the floorboards. The lamp flame trembled when she struck it. Her hands were stiff, but they found her shawl, her boots, her ledger. Habit moved faster than fear. In the kitchen, smoke was pushing out through the stove door in bitter gray breaths. Tobias Flint stood near it with one arm raised over his mouth. Reuben Pike had opened the back door, and snow blew across the threshold in a wild white sheet. Caleb Softhorse stood barefoot beside the table, eyes wide, coat clutched against his chest. Tala Redwater was tying her shawl over her hair, already reaching for the broth kettle. The stove's gone bad. Tobias coughed. Alma crossed the room and shut the back door against the storm. The latch caught with a hard crack. "No," she said. "The chimney is cold and the wind is stronger than the draft." She took the strip of muslin from its nail, opened the firebox only a hand's width, and held the cloth before it. The muslin jerked backward toward the room. The smoke wanted inside. Silas Crow came in from the hall, pulling on his coat. "What do you need?" "Small kindling, paper. No one opens that door unless I say." Tobias reached for the stove handle. "It needs air. It has too much of the wrong kind." For once he stopped. Alma twisted old newspaper, tight-lit one end, and held the flame carefully inside the flue. The fire licked upward, weak at first, then stronger. She waited until the air above the stove began to move. Only then did she feed in wrist-thin kindling, one piece, then another, closing the firebox quickly each time. The smoke hesitated. Every person in the kitchen watched it. Then the gray stream bent upward and vanished into the chimney. No one cheered. The room only breathed again. Outside, dawn failed to arrive. The windows whitened. Snow drove so thick against the glass that the world beyond the porch disappeared. By breakfast, the wagon road was gone. By noon, the fence rails showed only in broken lines. The pump handle froze solid beneath a coat of ice, and the creek path vanished under drifting snow. Cold Crow Creek Ranch had been cut from the earth. Alma took the stormboard from the pantry wall and set it on the table where every hand could see it. Hard biscuits, broth before dawn and dusk, coffee concentrate only. Men go out in pairs, rope between house barn woodpile and lower pen. No open firebox, no wasted fuel. Warm mash twice daily. Count every return. Silas read it once and nodded. "We do it her way." That settled the matter better than any speech. The first day was work. Reuben and Silas tied rope lines from the porch to the barn, from the barn to the woodpile, from the woodpile to the lower pen. The wind shoved them sideways with each step. Snow struck their faces sharp as thrown sand. They came back with ice in their lashes and breath tearing from their chests. Tala warmed broth and willow tea. Alma rationed hard biscuits and cut salt pork thin enough that Tobias muttered under his breath, though he ate every bite. Caleb stood at the window between chores watching the barn, the horses, the direction of drifting snow. "The horses are tight together," he said. "Good," Alma answered. "They still know where warmth is." On the second day, the lower pen nearly disappeared. The 9 heifers crowded behind the haystack where Alma had ordered the feed moot. Wind tore over the top but could not hit them square. Their backs were white with snow, their breath rising in quick clouds. Little Ember stood in the middle, narrow and trembling, but standing. Alma mixed warm mash in 2 buckets bran sour milk, bred ends salt and hot water. Reuben carried one. Silas carried the other. Caleb begged to go, but Alma made him stay at the door and count them back. 2 men out, she said. 2 men in. You say it aloud when they return. He swallowed and nodded. When Reuben and Silas came back through the white, Caleb shouted 2 in. His voice cracked, but it held. On the 3rd day, a hand named Mercer complained that the heifers were getting warm mash while men ate hard biscuits. Alma looked up from the broth kettle. Her face was pale from lack of sleep flour streaked across one cheek, her broad shoulders wrapped in a shawl. She had been on her feet since before dawn and would be on them long after dark. "Winter does not punish the weak first," she said. "It punishes the careless." Mercer said nothing more. The words stayed in the room after she spoke them. They seemed to settle into the bowls, the rope by the door, the kindling beside the stove, the ledger under her hand. On the 4th day, fever came. One of the younger ranch hands, Ellis, returned from the barn, shaking so hard his teeth clicked. By evening, his skin burned and his breathing turned shallow. Tala steeped willow bark with dried chokecherries, while Alma warmed broth and spooned it past his cracked lips. Old Amos Two Moons sat beside him through the dark, telling low stories of winters older than anyone in the room, winters that had taken proud men and spared quiet ones. "Don't fight the cold with anger," Amos told the half-conscious boy. "Anger spends too much heat." On the 5th day, the hay path vanished entirely. Reuben and Tobias went out together to clear it. They were gone too long. Silas paced by the door, one hand on the latch, the other on the rope line. Alma stood beside him, listening past the wind. The rope jerked once, then again. Silas hauled. Reuben stumbled in first, dragging Tobias behind him. The old man's beard was packed with ice, and one glove was gone. His hand was red and stiff, already clumsy. Alma did not scold. She took his hand between hers and eased it near warmth not too close to the stove. Tobias stared at the floor. Lost the line for a minute. But not each other, Alma said. His mouth tightened. That was the nearest he came to gratitude. On the 6th day, Caleb disappeared. It happened between one breath and the next. He had gone only to the woodpile tied to the porch rope carrying an empty feed bucket because he wanted to prove he could help. The wind struck hard enough to blind the yard. The rope snapped against a buried edge of split wood and went slack. Bluebell rose from beside the stove and barked like something had bitten her heart. Alma seized the rope before anyone else moved. "Reuben, I'm with you." Silas stepped forward. "I'll go." "You hold the line," Alma said. "If we lose it, you pull." She tied the rope around her waist, wrapped her shawl tight, and went into the white with Reuben beside her. The cold hit so hard it stole shape from the world. There was no barn, no house, no sky, only snow and the violent pull of wind. Alma moved one step at a time, her heavy body braced low, one hand on the rope, the other reaching into nothing. She called Caleb's name, but the storm tore it away. Bluebell's bark came from somewhere left. They found him half buried near the woodpile, curled around the feed bucket as if the pail were a child he had promised to save. His lips were blue, his lashes were white. But when Alma touched his face, he groaned. "Alive," she shouted. Reuben lifted him under the arms. Alma held the rope and pushed through the drift, each step a bargain with the wind. When Silas dragged them through the door, Tala slammed it shut behind them. Caleb cried when his hands began to thaw. "I dropped the grain," he whispered. Alma wrapped his fingers in warm cloth. "You brought the bucket back. That counts." His tears came harder then, but quieter. On the 7th morning, somebody pounded on the door. Not knocked, pounded. Silas opened it against the chain and a man fell through the gap, beard white with ice, coat frozen stiff. He was one of Luther Bell's hands. His knees hit the floor, and for a moment he could not speak. Tala brought broth. The man drank like the cup was salvation. "Bell sent me," he rasped. "2 men down with fever. Flour spoiled in the cellar. Weak cattle won't touch hay." He looked toward Alma, shame and desperation fighting in his frozen face. "He wants to know how you make that mash." The room went still. Everyone remembered Luther laughing in the yard. Alma remembered too. She remembered his red face, his loud voice, his claim that beef, firewood, and courage were enough. She took a clean bucket. "Watch clothes," she said. She mixed bran sour milk. Bread ends, warm water, and salt. Not too thin, not too cold. Small enough to feed often. Tala wrapped dried berry cakes. Caleb, pale but awake, cut a strip of rawhide and tied it around the bucket handle. Tobias carried wrist-sized kindling to the stove without being asked. The man left with broth mash and instructions tucked inside his coat. 2 days later, the wind weakened enough for Luther Bell himself to reach the ranch. He looked older than he had when he laughed. Frostbite marked one cheek. His eyes did not lift easily. "Our broth's gone," he said. "Half the flour soured. Cattle are failing." Alma tore brown paper from a sack and wrote what mattered. Raise flour off the floor. Leave air beneath. Sort rot fast. Feed warm mash small and often. Broth before fever takes strength. Never wait until an animal quits standing. Luther accepted the paper with both hands. No apology passed his lips. The way he held that paper said enough. When the wind finally eased, Alma walked with Caleb to the lower pen. The snow was deep, the air cruelly bright. One by one they counted the heifers. All 9 stood. Little Ember lifted her head, thin and rough-coated, then lowered it again to the mash. Alma opened her ledger with swollen fingers and wrote slowly, 9 standing, flour dry, fire clean, men alive. Beyond the white fields, the buried road had begun to show itself in broken gray lines. Silas stood on the porch, staring toward the east where polished wheels would come as soon as a man from Fort Benton believed the storm had finished speaking. The road came back in pieces. First, a gray scar showed beyond the lower pen where the wind had scraped the snow thin. Then the tops of wagon ruts appeared near the creek crossing. By noon, the white fields were no less cold, no less dangerous, but they had begun to remember where men once traveled. Alma Heavy Willow stood at the kitchen window with her ledger open in one hand and a pencil in the other. Her fingers were still swollen from cold and work. Flour dust had settled into the cracks of her knuckles. Beneath her shawl, her shoulders ached in a deep, familiar way, the kind of ache that came after a person had spent too many days holding a whole place together without speaking of it. Outside, the 9 heifers stood in the lower pen. They were thin. No one could call them pretty. Their coats still showed winter's rough handling, and Little Ember's hips were sharper than Alma liked. But all 9 were upright. All 9 lowered their heads when Caleb's soft horse poured the warm mash into the trough. All 9 ate. That was enough for a morning that had asked too much already. Silas Crow came in quietly behind her. He had slept little since the blizzard broke. His beard was rough, his eyes darker than before, and his hands were cut from rope ice and wood. He looked past Alma toward the road. "He'll come today," he said. Alma did not ask who. Fort Benton men always came when the road allowed it. They trusted roads more than weather papers, more than hands and debts, more than breathing cattle. She made one last note. 9 standing, mash accepted, flour dry, broth stores low but sufficient, men alive. Then she closed the ledger. Then he should see what Winter left standing, she said. By mid-afternoon, the polished buggy appeared at the far bend, dark against the snow. Its wheels jerked through frozen ruts. The horse tossed its head, displeased by the broken road, but Gideon Sutter sat straight as fence wire, wrapped in his fine wool coat, carrying his certainty like another blanket. He slowed when he reached the lower pen. Alma watched from the porch. So did Silas Reuben Pike, Tobias Flint, old Amos Two Moons, Caleb, and Tala Redwater. No one had called them there. They came because some reckonings did not belong to one man alone. Gideon's eyes moved over the pen. 1 heifer, 2, 3, all the way to 9. His expression did not break, but something in it lost its smoothness. The storm had marked everything at Cold Crow Creek Ranch. It had stripped paint, bent a gate hinge, buried half the smokehouse wall, and left ice thick on the creek stones. But it had not given Gideon what he expected. No dead heifers lay against the fence. No desperate men waited with hats in hand. No spoiled flour sacks sat open like proof. Gideon stepped down from the buggy and brushed snow from his sleeve, though none had settled there. "Mr. Crow," he said. "Mr. Sutter." Gideon looked toward Alma, then away. "I see the road is opened enough for business," old Amos murmured. Road opened enough for truth, maybe. If Gideon heard him, he gave no sign. Inside, the dining room felt warmer than it had any right to feel after such a storm. The stove drew clean. A neat stack of wrist-sized kindling waited beside it, split as evenly as church candles. The pantry door stood open, showing sacks raised from the floor on rough boards. Jars of broth cooled on a shelf. Dried chokecherries hung in cloth bundles where air could move around them. The storm board still hung near the pantry charcoal line, smudged but readable. Gideon removed his gloves this time. Silas placed 2 ledgers on the table. One was Gideon's clean and square, smelling faintly of leather oil and office drawers. The other was Alma's, worn, soft at the corners, flour caught in its cover, the pages swollen slightly from kitchen damp and winter handling. Gideon's eyes settled on the little book. No one sat until Alma did. Silas pulled out the chair beside him, the same chair that had stood empty the day Gideon tried to sell the heifers out from under the ranch. Alma lowered herself into it carefully. Her body was tired, heavy with sleepless nights and labor, but she did not shrink inside it. Not now. Gideon opened his ledger first. "The debt remains $525. "Winter did not pay it for us," Silas said. "No, it did not." Alma opened her book and turned to the last winter column. Her pencil marks were plain and close together. No fine script, no decoration, just the living record of what had been used, saved, stretched, and kept alive. She turned the ledger so Gideon could read. Flour dry, coffee stretched, hard biscuit loss none, broth shared with Bell Ranch, fever contained, hay loss controlled, 9 heifers standing, Little Ember eating twice daily, projected spring breeding value revised upward. Gideon leaned closer despite himself. Alma pointed to the feed column. The warm mash reduced waste. The weakest heifers held their feet. They ate through the worst days. She moved her finger lower. The flour stayed dry because it was raised. We lost no sacks to damp. Bell's ranch lost half of theirs against a cellar wall. Luther Bell was not there, but his absence had weight. Everyone knew he had carried Alma's brown paper instructions home with both hands. Gideon's jaw tightened. Neighboring failure does not erase debt. No, Alma said, but it explains value. She turned another page. If these heifers calf in spring, the return is no longer today's winter beef price. It is breeding stock calves and contracts after thaw. The sale you offered would have shrunk the debt and the future at the same time. Gideon looked at Silas. These are projections. So are yours, Silas said. A quiet passed through the room. Old Amos sat under the window, his hands folded over his stick. A paper can count money, he said. It takes living to count winter. Gideon did not answer at once. His eyes moved from Amos to the pantry shelves, from the shelves to the stormboard, from the stormboard to Tobias standing by the stove. Tobias had his arms crossed, but there was no mockery in him now. His right hand still reddened from the day he nearly froze. It rested near the kindling stack he had split himself. Gideon looked last at Alma. He did not call her the kitchen woman. "May I copy these figures?" he asked. Silas turned to Alma. That small movement said more than any public praise could have said. The room saw it. Gideon saw it. Alma saw it too, though she kept her face still. After a moment she nodded. "You may copy them," she said. "Not the recipes." For the first time since he had arrived, Reuben Pike smiled. Gideon copied in silence. His handwriting was neat but slower than before. When he finished, he closed his ledger and stood. "The office will expect payment after spring contracts. You will have your payment," Silas said. Gideon put on his gloves. At the door he paused and looked once more toward the lower pen where 9 narrow backs stood dark against the snow. "Winter was kinder than it might have been," he said. Alma looked at him. Winter was winter. That was all. After he left the buggy, wheels cracked over the frozen road until the sound faded into the open country. No one cheered when he was gone. Cold Crow Creek was not a place for cheering over things that had nearly killed them. Men returned to work. Tala checked the broth. Caleb went to the pen. Tobias fed the stove with 2 small sticks and shut the firebox quickly, exactly as Alma had taught him. Alma stood alone at the table, one hand on her ledger. For a moment she felt the weight of every mile that had brought her here. The road outside Willow Bend Crossing, the thorn bush, the bitter chokecherries, her mother's grave. The empty place where the cook stove used to stand, the way men's eyes had measured her body and found only something to dismiss. Silas came back into the kitchen near dusk. The room had quieted. Bluebell slept beside the stove, nose tucked under her tail. The pantry shelves stood dry and raised. The muslin strip hung from its nail. Alma was scraping the breadboard clean with slow, tired strokes. Silas stopped across from her. "When I found you on that road," he said, "I thought I was bringing home a cook." Alma did not look up. "You were?" "No." His voice was low. "I brought home the reason this place is still standing." The scraper paused. Outside, the last light lay cold and gold across the snow. Silas placed both hands on the back of a chair. He was not a man given to easy words, and that made each one carry farther. "I'd like you to stay. Not until the thaw. Not just for wages." He looked toward the pantry, then the stove, then back to her. "Through spring, through fall, every season after if you choose it. Not behind me, beside me." Alma's throat tightened before she could stop it. She thought of Nita Heavy Willow, who had taught her that food was memory and fire was responsibility. She thought of every laugh she had swallowed, every insult she had outworked, every time hunger had tried to bend her into something smaller than herself. She looked toward the pantry shelves. "Will they stay raised?" Silas smiled faintly, the warmth of it rare and real. "As long as we are both here." Alma nodded once. That was answer enough. 4 winters passed. The bear paw wind did not grow gentle. January still came with iron in its teeth. Snow still buried the road when it pleased. But Cold Crow Creek Ranch no longer waited for weather to teach it fear. Flour never touched damp walls. Beans sat raised on boards. Kindling was split wrist-thin before December. Storm biscuits were baked while autumn still held color in the grass. Broth jars filled the shelves. Every new hand learned to warm the flue before feeding the stove. Every young animal was watched before weakness became collapse. The 9 heifers became the beginning of a strong breeding herd. Little Ember dropped her first calf in a dawn so cold the steam rose from the newborn like a prayer. Tala Redwater grew into a steady young woman who knew herbs broth berries, and silence better than most doctors knew medicine. Caleb Softhorse became a horseman. Men listened to when the wind shifted. Reuben ran cattle with fewer losses because fed men made fewer foolish mistakes. Tobias Flint Gray, and stubborn as ever, taught new hands how to split kindling and scolded them if the pieces came out too thick. He never said Alma had been right. He lived as if she had been. Luther Bell sent riders every fall to learn how to keep flour dry and cattle eating through hard cold. He never laughed in Alma's yard again. One evening, when the 4th winter had softened into a pale late light, Silas came into the kitchen carrying a small cloth bag. He set it gently on the table. Alma untied the string. Inside lay dried chokecherries, dark and wrinkled, bitter-looking as the day she had first crouched beside the road and gathered them with bleeding fingers. For a long moment she did not move. Then the smallest smile touched her face. She remembered hunger. She remembered pride. She remembered the question that had come from horseback before she even turned around. "Can you cook?" Around her, the stove breathed clean. The shelves stood dry. Bluebell slept old and gray beside the hearth. Outside, cattle moved through the snow in a herd built from what had nearly been sold. She had not just cooked for them, she had taught them how to live before dying became easy. Silas stood beside her, saying nothing because some truths were too large for speech and too plain to miss. Alma took one dried chokecherry between her fingers. Once, it had meant surviving another hour. Now it meant home.